What's up guys, it's Philip from the Honda Resource. I just bought this Honda Element. I actually don't even know what year it is. Hold on. It's a 2003 Honda Element. It's manual, front wheel drive. It's got some transmission issues and I'm gonna fix it and sell it. Yeah, let's see where this goes. All right, so to begin with, I got it up on my lift. Got the wheels off of it. The lug nuts are 19 millimeter if they're stock. Mine had aftermarket lug nuts on it because they had some different wheels on it. So the axle nut is a 36 millimeter, so we'll take that off on each side. And then I take off up here for take the shock off of the spindle here. And it's a 22 for the nut, and then the actual bolt head is a 19. So do that for both sides. And then I'm going to take the brake caliper off, and so it's a 14, I think, no, I'm sorry, it's a 12 millimeter on top and a 12 millimeter right down here. See it right there. All right, and then there's also a 12 millimeter holds the brake line on here. So pop all three of those off, and then you can take the caliper off and set it to the side, or I'll probably hang it up here on the shock. All right, so see I've got the caliper laid up here, and if your axle's stuck like mine is, I get that off is just put the axle nut back on there just a little bit. And I have an old extension that I pretty much just use for stuff like this. You can't really use it on a ratchet anymore because it's mushroomed out, but put it in the center on the end of the axle and hit it with my 2-pound sledgehammer. So then that frees it up and usually come on out, but if you just bang on the end of the axle, it's going to mushroom it and you'll find yourself buying a new axle. So don't just take this and waylay it, you know. I've already got it loose, so tap it on out of there. Alright, so now we'll get this axle out. Alright, and then to get the axle out, just use the pry bar. Put it between the transmission and the axle here. Pop right out. We'll do the same process for the passenger side now. All right, so to get this passenger side axle off of the half shaft, again I use my same extension and I put it on the back of the axle there. It pops it right off. So once I get the axles out, I take one of the bolts here and put it back. That way whenever I drop the subframe down, it'll hold the subframe up by this bolt on each side and it won't hit the ground. The next thing I'm going to do is take this plastic off down here and these little clips. You can use a flat head and just get under them and they should pop right out. All right, don't forget the two on each side and the wheel well too. A 10 millimeter on each side. And down it comes. All right, so next thing we need to do is get our motor mount loose here and the rear mount. So it's got 3 14s back here and 1 17 up here. And then we'll be ready to remove the subframe. All right, so the 14s are right here. Now the rear mount's loose. Right there. So it's 17 millimeter. Alright, so that's out. And now we're ready to remove the subframe. Alright, it's 4 17 millimeter bolts that holds it on. Again, I've got the bolts holding the spindles to the shocks on each side, so the subframe's not going to fall on me. But it's got 4 17 millimeter bolts, so 1, 2, 3, and 4. And the subframe come down. Alright. So now we got the subframe here. You can let the car down to where this touches the ground. Then we unbolt it from the shocks here, and we could take the subframe out. All right, so now it's on the ground. Just take my bolts out. Now I can pick the car back up. Now we can get the subframe and get it out of here. All right, so now, obviously it's a little later. Actually, it's actually several days later. But now I have to get this half shaft out. So it's just 12 millimeter. All right, then there's 3 14 millimeter bolts that holds the half shaft to the block. And on those, 2 of them have a shoulder and 1 don't. So the one that don't have the shoulder is this one. The other 2 have shoulders. And then once you get those 3 bolts out, this half shaft, intermediate shaft will slide out. And then we can take off this reinforcement girdle plate, whatever you want to call it. It's 14, so it's got 14 here, 1 here, 1 here, and 1 right here on the front of the motor. So I guess now we can go ahead and remove these 2 17 millimeter bolts. Holds the bell housing. Alright, get both of those out. Alright, so the next thing I need to do is to get this mount off the front. It has 3 bolts. They're all 17. All right, so now that I got that off, I can take out the 17 millimeter bolt that's here. And I can take out the one on the bottom of the starter. On the element, it has a speed sensor right here. That comes off. And we can use a pair of pliers to take off the connector. All right, so I guess that's everything that we're gonna do from the bottom. Let it down now and start on the top. All right, so now I need to get the battery out. This battery is not OEM, as I'm sure you can tell. All right, so now I need to get this intake box out of the way. All right, so the clamps on the the intake are 5.5 millimeter. So you could probably use a Phillips head because it has a Phillips head in the center of it, or you could just use a socket and take them off. There's our intake tube. And then take off this air box, 10 millimeter back there and a 10 millimeter down there. Actually, it's two 10 millimeters on this side. There we go. All right, so I just used about a 12-inch extension or so. I was able to get on the back side over here. So you see here it has these two, right, and then it has the one over here. And then this hose here went to this right here, and I just slid it off, got it out of the way. Here, I'll just take you over here and show what I'm going to be doing. So I have to take off this clutch line here. So it's got a 10 millimeter right there that holds this bracket. So you can just take that 10 millimeter out, and then let's see, you should be able to just take the two bolts out of the slave cylinder, which is right there, the two 12 millimeter bolts. And then that whole line should pop out of this clip, and you can take the whole line because it's going to flex on that rubber and set up over here out of the way. And then I'll take these shift cables off, so I'll take them off the cotter pins out here and here. And then I'll take these three 12 millimeter bolts out. There's 1, 2, 3, and then take the whole shifter's cables off here, and then just set them to the side also with the bracket attached. And then I got to remove the ground wire, which is like right there. It's the 10 millimeter. So that's what I'm about to do. Just want to be able to show you so that you can see what I'm doing, because I'm going to put the camera back over here on the tripod. Alright, so I've already got 10 millimeter on here, so I'm going to go ahead and take off the clutch line bracket back here. And I'm going to take off the ground strap. And take my 12. And I can take off the slave cylinder. Alright, so that's our two 12s that hold on the slave cylinder. Alright, and we'll take off the 3 that holds the shifter cables. Take off the cotter pins that hold the shift cables. So it has a little plastic bushing, and then it has the metal outer piece, so make sure you don't lose those. There are two different sizes. The one that's vertical is smaller than the one that's horizontal. Alright, so the cotter pins are small like this. That's what they look like. Not much to them. Like I said, I always put new ones in there. And so this is the holder and the plastic bushing for the one that sits vertical. I'm sorry, horizontal. All right, then they just slide off, and the whole cable assembly comes up. Take the bolts out just so they don't fall down. Just tuck it in up behind it there. So I have two shorter ones and one longer one. And slave line. Like I said, it'll move on the rubber line back there. Just put it up here out of the way. It's got a reverse sensor right here on top. Alright. Before I take the other two bell housing bolts out, I'm going to lift the car back up, make sure the transmission is drained, and then we'll set it back down and get those other bolts out. Alright, so to drain it, all you gotta do is use a 3/8 ratchet and put on the drain plug right here. And then it turns counterclockwise and comes right out. Get my drain pan set up, and then we'll get it drained. Alright, so the next thing I'm gonna do is take these, that nut that nut and that bolt out. They're all 17 millimeter, and then that's gonna let the transmission set down. I may go ahead and take off this bracket here. It's held in by a couple 10 millimeter bolts from the backside. It just aids with clearance, not having to fight with this. So we're taking those 3 loose, and then we'll take the remaining 2 bell housing bolts loose, and they're also 17 millimeter. Like one's right there, and the other one's about right up in there. So that's all that's holding the transmission right now. All right, so I've got a jack stand just under the oil pan. It's not even touching the oil pan yet, but whenever I let the transmission mount loose, it's gonna set the engine down, and the jack stand will catch the engine to keep the engine from falling, and I'll put a floor jack up under the transmission, and then I'll ease the transmission down with the floor jack. Let it down a little bit. I'm gonna pick the whole car up because now the engine is sitting on the jack stand, but it still don't have the clearance on the transmission mount yet, so that should allow me some more clearance. All right, so now we'll go ahead and get the 2 remaining bell housing bolts out. All right, so you see how that's lowered below the mount here, but it's still, the engine's being held up with the jack stand beneath it, so that it don't sag too far. And the jack's actually probably holding it up right now. Yeah, I was afraid of. So now the jack is not supporting it. So you can see we still have the clearance here, and the jack stand is supporting the engine by the end of the oil pan. I didn't put it in the center of the oil pan. I don't really want to mess with the oil pan. So it's on the edge of the oil pan, right where it makes up to the flywheel. But now I got to get these 2 bell housing bolts out, and then slide the transmission off. And so I just used my pry bar, my breaker bar with a socket to break those loose. Now I use my electric ratchet to get them out. And so now the transmission should separate from the motor. Definitely not wanting to give up easily. It'll come out though. Alright. It's a loose. Alright. So I got the transmission out. Well, alright guys, that concludes part 1 of this series. So make sure you hit that like, hit the subscribe so you can continue watching this series on the Element. We'll be on the next video, we'll be tearing into this transmission and see what's going on with it and getting it repaired. And then I think the 3rd part will be reinstallation. So make sure you hit the bell for notifications so that you know each time I upload one on this. So thanks for tuning in, and I hope to see you on the next one. Peace.